The harbinger of impending destruction, known as the Doomsday Clock, sits with its hands positioned close to midnight, and with every tick, the threat of global nuclear conflict grows even larger. But just how imminent is this threat? As the war in Ukraine rages on, Russian officials have not shied away from chilling rhetoric hinting at the nuclear option. Indeed, President Vladimir Putin himself, as quoted by Reuters in March of this year, has stated that his country is more than ready to use nuclear weapons if the existence of the Russian state, our sovereignty and independence, is threatened. We need to hope that this rhetoric is merely posturing as Russia tries to dissuade the West from aiding Ukraine. But what if it's not? What would unfold if Russia launched all of its nuclear weapons at once? It certainly wouldn't be a good day for humanity and the planet, but how likely is it? Let's look at one frighteningly plausible scenario and explore how the fallout would be devastating in more ways than one. Imagine that Vladimir Putin, the cool but calculating leader of Russia, was told by doctors that he only had months to live. Possibly he could just put his affairs in order and shuffle quietly off into the pages of history, leaving the world a much improved place. However, Putin's track record suggests a darker path could be equally credible. For instance, Putin's opponents have an unfortunate tendency to meet untimely and mysterious ends, both at home and abroad. The recent death of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny and one-time ally-turned-failed coup leader Wagner head Yevgeny Prigozhin are recent examples of this trend. These incidents paint a picture of a leader who doesn't shy away from extreme measures to eliminate threats or assert his power. His administration has been marked by a readiness to use force to achieve its goals, as seen in military actions in Chechnya, Georgia, and Syria, and his support for the use of controversial tactics. Of course, Ukraine must also be mentioned in this context. In this scenario, the possibility that Putin, faced with his mortality, might resort to an unthinkable action becomes more conceivable. Driven by a desire to not just be remembered, but to be immortalized in history, he might consider launching Russia's nuclear arsenal as a final act of defiance and dominance. This would be a decision made from a combination of desperation, megalomania, and a nihilistic disregard for the global consequences. Waiting until the very last moment, he presses the button, and to quote the classic song about nuclear Armageddon, 99 red balloons go by. But just how fearsome is the Russian nuclear arsenal? Regarding warheads, obtaining 100% accurate information is challenging due to the secretive policies of nuclear states and current geopolitical tensions. Nevertheless, we can obtain a pretty reliable estimate from the Arms Control Association, the ACA. According to the ACA, as of March 1, 2022, Russia was reported to have 526 deployed strategic delivery systems, 1,474 deployed strategic nuclear warheads, and a total of 761 deployed and non-deployed strategic launchers. However, the figures aren't quite as clear-cut as this, as many of these systems are in the process of being retired and replaced by newer systems. Current ACA estimates conclude that when Putin pushes the button, a total of 1,181 land-based warheads will be available upon 320 launch systems. Then there are still submarine-borne missiles to consider. Again, it's difficult to determine precise numbers due to fleet readiness and other factors, but according to the ACA, Russia has about 656 submarine-based nuclear warheads to throw into the mix. Finally, we need to look at Russia's strategic bomber fleet. The Russian Long-Range Aviation Command, LRA, is made up of 6 divisions. As of early 2020, it was estimated to have 66 strategic bombers at its disposal, with the older Tu-95 Bear aircraft making up the bulk of these, with an estimated 55 in service. The remainder consists of the more modern Tu-160 White Swan bombers. The ACA estimates that the LRA has the capability to launch around 200 warheads. Theoretically, this means that when Putin pulls the trigger, a total of 2,037 warheads will be launched. But let's pause for a reality check. One thing that the war in Ukraine has told us is that the state of Russian military hardware, and we are being kind here, has been underwhelming. Poor or non-existent maintenance, rampant corruption, theft, and embezzlement have all made Russia's previously much vaunted war machine look more like a trip to the local scrapyard. But let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Let's assume that the Russians placed more importance on the maintenance of their nuclear arms than they did on the rest of their military hardware, and round it down to a mere 2,000 warheads. This is still a lot of warheads, and to understand their destructive potential, we need to take into account their yield. Nuclear warhead yields vary widely, but let's start by eliminating smaller battlefield warheads, such as those used in tactical roles, and concentrate on the missile-bound warheads that will be aimed at strategic Western targets. The current stock of Russian strategic nuclear warheads has yields ranging from about 100 kilotons to 800 kilotons, and potentially higher. For instance, according to a report by the Washington Post, some Russian warheads could have yields reaching up to 1 megaton. When compared to the Tsar bomber that Russia detonated on October 30, 1961, which had a yield of 50 megatons, these figures might seem relatively paltry. However, they are more than powerful enough to ensure that anyone standing within a few miles of a detonation will have a very bad day. At the lower end of the scale are the Intercontinental Ballistic Missiles (ICBM) warheads carried on the RS-24 Yars missile. This is classified as a Multiple Independently Targetable Re-entry Vehicle, or MRIV, meaning it can deploy multiple warheads at several targets. These typically have yields ranging from 250 to 300 kilotons each. In a similar range are the R-30 Bulava and R-29 MRU Sineva submarine-launched ballistic missiles, the SLBMs. These are also classified as MRIV systems, with warhead yields varying from 100 to 150 kilotons. Next up are the warheads carried on airborne cruise missiles, including the nuclear-capable KH-102 missile. These are launched from the aforementioned Tu-95 and Tu-160 strategic bombers and can carry a nuclear warhead of up to 250 kilotons. It's also worth touching on older free-fall bomb types like the B-61, which have variable yields of up to 340 kilotons, while the latest variant, the B-61-13, reportedly yields 360 kilotons. Although whether these would be used in this scenario is debatable. However, all these pale into insignificance when we look at the warheads carried by the appropriately named SS-18 Satan missile. This MIRV warhead delivery system can carry up to 10 warheads per missile, with yields ranging from 500 to 800 kilotons. According to ACA, Russia has 46 of these missiles ready to go. So to recap, we have 2,000 warheads of varying yields to consider, but let's split the difference and call each warhead around 500 kilotons. To get an idea of how powerful this is, it's worth noting that the bomb that all but destroyed Hiroshima toward the end of World War II was 15 kilotons. This means that if Putin launches a full-scale nuclear attack, we can apply a bit of simple arithmetic and infer that 1 million kilotons of highly radioactive destruction are heading our way. Of course, that's far from the end of the matter. Western powers are unlikely to sit back staring at radar screens and waiting for the world to go up in smoke. The West will undoubtedly respond in kind. We won't go into too much detail on the size of this response. Instead, let's assume that the New Strategic Arms Treaty, or New START, an agreement aimed at reducing the number of strategic nuclear missile launches by half, has been effective. This would mean that both the US and Russia have maintained equal nuclear capabilities. However, we shouldn't forget other nuclear powers like the UK and France, who will also have a say in the matter. But in terms of potential global catastrophe, the US and Russia alone possess more than enough firepower to ensure the mutually assured destruction that the arms race historically sought to prevent. So the Doomsday Clock chimes midnight. Putin presses the button, and 4,000 nuclear warheads start screaming toward their targets. From silos and submarines, from air bases and mobile launchers, 2 million kilotons of mutually assured destruction begin to crisscross the globe. How would the situation unfold? In the command centers around the world, screens light up as warning systems detect the launches, plunging military and political leaders into panicked efforts to coordinate responses. Emergency protocols are activated as governments attempt to secure essential personnel and advise the public of the imminent threat. From the depths of the Arctic Ocean to the strategically located air bases across the globe, missiles and bombers laden with enough explosive power to devastate whole continents arch into the sky. Prowling submarines emerge from silent patrols as their captains and crew perform the one task they were trained for and hoped they would never have to perform. Bombers laden with destructive armament lumber into the air on their final mission, their crews grimly aware of the gravity of their orders. Across Europe and the US, missile silos positioned in remote and secure locations swing open, revealing deadly payloads that soon streak toward the heavens. But just where are all these missiles and bombs heading? What targets would be prioritized in such a scenario? The bad news is that with this many missiles, it's likely to be somewhere near you. Let's examine the potential targets and the reasons for their selection. We'll start with the bigger picture. Let's say that even on his deathbed, Putin is not crazy enough to attack China, one of his few allies. Let's also assume that the other nuclear powers, including the likes of Pakistan, India, and North Korea, decide to sit this one out, wait for the dust to settle, and see what emerges after the big boys have finished fighting. In essence, this means we can begin on the assumption that the majority of these warheads are going to fall in the northern hemisphere. More specifically, the USA, Russia, and Western Europe will take the brunt of the attack and the response. According to the retired Air Force General John Hyten, the Air Force General formerly in charge of America's nuclear armaments, the window of opportunity to respond is frighteningly short. From detection to the creation of an explosion is less than 30 minutes, he said. He also noted that if the missiles didn't pose an existential threat, then the US would only respond in kind. It's fair to say that the sudden launch of Russia's entire nuclear arsenal would be considered an existential threat. Effectively, this means that a full-scale Russian nuclear attack would warrant a similarly scaled response. Given the brevity of this response window, it's reasonable to expect that key strategic and command structures such as the Pentagon, Cheyenne Mountain Air Force Station, Whitehall, and the Élysée Palace would be among the primary targets as the Russians attempt to mute response capabilities. This would require a swift and comprehensive response if the West was to retaliate while the capability to do so still exists. Similarly, the first targets of the nations of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, would be the Russian equivalents. Among them would be the Kremlin and the Russian Ministry of Defense, as well as key command centers. Ultimately, these attacks would aim to reduce Putin's capability to launch further nuclear strikes. Next on the list of Russian targets will be major US military bases and installations. These targets would be considered a priority to attempt to minimize the response to the attack and disrupt any possible military response, for what that would be worth. High up on the list would be missile silos, air bases, and naval dockyards. Prime examples of where these attacks would fall include Fort Bragg in the USA, Ramstein Air Base in Germany, and Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. These can all be considered Phase 1 targets, and so far, although the collateral damage will be enormous, these targets have all been military or governmental. For the vast majority of the civilian population, Phase 2 is when the real carnage begins. Moving into Phase 2 of the attack, we'll see the focus shifting from command and control targets to civilian infrastructure. The rationale here is to prolong recovery times and maximize the disruption to everyday life. At this stage, it could perhaps be noted that the impact of 4,000 nuclear warheads would manage this perfectly well without such precise targeting. But let's put that thought aside as we look at the targets likely to be prioritized during this phase of the attack. First up are likely to be power plants and electrical substations, including nuclear facilities. These are obviously essential for society to function, and within a few minutes of the first missile strikes, the lights would go out across most of the northern hemisphere. As a secondary consideration, it's impossible to ignore the effects of nuclear attacks on their peaceful brethren. There are currently 93 operating nuclear reactors in the US and 168 in Europe. The vast majority of these will be targeted. Therefore, we also need to factor in dealing with 200+ Chernobyl-type or worse accidents on top of everything else. While Phase 2 typically focuses on crippling civilian infrastructure to maximize disruption, it's worth noting that strategic attacks on electrical infrastructure and power grids could also occur in Phase 1. Such early strikes would likely use nuclear weapons to generate a widespread electromagnetic pulse of tens of thousands of volts per meter. This would immediately incapacitate electronic and communication systems with the intention of disabling or at least hindering response capabilities. Next on the list are likely to be the transportation hubs. Facilities like airports, train stations, and dockyards would all be targeted. Of course, the aim here is to disrupt movement and by doing so, further hinder recovery operations and evacuation procedures. Already the picture is a bleak one, but now the missiles start to rain down on major population centers. Most of the major cities across the Northern Hemisphere will be targeted, many with more than one warhead. These will be the focus both because of their military assets and as an additional tactic to slow recovery efforts. Across the US, Europe, and Russia, the same scenario will be played out hundreds of times. Each detonation over these heavily inhabited areas will create a huge fireball as hot as the core of the sun. Those close enough to the blast will be instantly vaporized. For those further away, blindness, burns, and radiation await as mushroom clouds fill the northern skies. Cities will melt and disintegrate as blast waves and firestorms consume them. Glass and asphalt will be turned into rivers of flaming hot liquid. Buildings will implode, explode, and come crashing to the ground. To get an idea of how bad this would be, we can turn to the information from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, or the BAS. This is the organization that determines just how close to midnight the Doomsday Clock is. They continually monitor the nuclear threat and are a recognized authority on the immediate and long-term effects of a nuclear strike, including on major population centers. According to the BAS, the effects of a single 300-kiloton warhead on a city such as New York would lead to 1 million deaths and about twice as many people suffering serious injuries within the first 24 hours. And remember that a city as important as New York City is likely to be targeted by multiple warheads. And we haven't even touched on an aftermath that contains such horrors as radiation fallout and prolonged nuclear winter. But before we discuss this, we have one major factor that could have an impact on the severity of the attack to consider. Just how many warheads will actually reach their targets? Both the US and the Russians have various systems designed to intercept incoming ballistic missiles. Among these, the American Ground-Based Mid-Course Defense, the GMD, and the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, or THAAD, are prominent. The GMD is designed to target incoming warheads in space during their mid-course phase of their trajectory, whereas THAAD intercepts short to intermediate-range ballistic missiles during their terminal phase, close to the ground. Despite their advanced technology, these systems will probably have little effect on the bigger picture. They are tested under relatively controlled conditions and may not perform as expected under the stress of a real, large-scale nuclear assault. Factors such as the sheer volume of warheads, sophisticated countermeasures like decoys, MIRVs from advanced ballistic missiles, and the possibility of simultaneous attacks from different directions can overwhelm these defense systems. Additionally, the reliability of missile defense is still a subject of much debate among experts. While they may intercept some incoming threats, the consensus is that in a scenario involving hundreds or even thousands of warheads, the systems would not be able to prevent a substantial portion of the missiles from reaching their targets. Basically, the defense systems might mitigate some damage, but are unlikely to change the fundamentally devastating outcome of such an assault. 30 minutes have now passed since Putin ordered his nukes to be launched, and the immediate aftermath is already a dreadful scenario as the bombs begin to strike their targets. According to a simulation by Princeton University, 90 million people would be dead and injured within a few hours of the attack being launched. But this is an estimate. Other figures from the BAS have stated that the quick deaths as a result of such a conflict could be as high as 360 million. Either way, these are appalling numbers, but the worst is yet to come. Radioactive fallout and an oncoming nuclear winter are still to be reckoned with, and by the time they're finished with us, 90 or even 360 million deaths will seem like peanuts. Let's begin by looking at the effects of radioactive fallout. Just how catastrophic would this be for humanity? Pinning down precise figures for this is difficult. There are many variables that must be considered. For starters, the type of bomb, size, and number of warheads have obvious implications here, but that isn't the whole story. The height the bomb is detonated also has a bearing on radioactivity levels. However, the consensus is that the area of immediate danger could be as much as hundreds, if not thousands, of square miles downwind of the blast zone. Initially, this will be dominated by short-lived radioactive isotopes like iodine-131, which has a half-life of about 8 days. These, although short-lived, are highly energetic. For anyone who is within a mile or two of the blast zone and has miraculously survived the initial explosion, this is further bad news. Estimates put the likely ionizing radiation exposure at around 500 Roentgen equivalent man, REM, a measurement of the health effects of radiation. According to the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission, this dose will likely be fatal without medical treatment, which in these circumstances must be considered highly unlikely. But long-lived radioactive isotopes are also among the hundreds of radionuclides that are released in a nuclear explosion. These include such nasties as cesium-137 and strontium-90. Although these don't deliver the immediate, intense energy of their short-lived cousins, their longevity and persistence pose an ongoing threat to environmental and human health. Cesium-137, for example, has a half-life of about 30 years. During this period, it can continue contaminating water and soil, turning agriculture or the simple act of drinking water into a game of deadly roulette. The accumulation of such isotopes in the food chain can lead to chronic health problems and genetic damage over generations. Effectively, vast swathes of land, both urban and rural, would become uninhabitable for decades afterwards. We only need to look at the aftermath of the Chernobyl and Fukushima accidents to confirm this. Across Europe and the US, cities and towns, even if untouched by explosions, would become ghost towns. Life for the survivors would become something of a lottery, with the safety of living environments across much of the directly affected countries becoming uncertain. Without access to proper radiation monitoring equipment, there will be no reliable way to determine the safety of the lands they inhabit. This is not a happy scenario, but the bad news is that the bad news continues to pile up. The threat of a prolonged nuclear winter has yet to rear its ugly head, and for humanity, this could be the final nail in the coffin. But just how bad will a nuclear winter be, and what are the root causes? While there's no consensus on the severity of a nuclear winter or its duration, given the scale of the scenario being played out, it's fair to say that this could, for the survivors, be the last straw. Fundamentally, a nuclear winter happens because of the immense quantities of smoke and soot thrust into the stratosphere by the burning cities, forests, and oil fields ignited by the nuclear explosions. These particles would absorb solar radiation, significantly reducing the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth's surface. This in turn would lead to a dramatic drop in surface temperatures, perhaps by as much as 20 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, affecting global climate patterns and our ability to grow crops. Imagine hundreds of cities and thousands of square miles of forestry and countryside all burning at the same time, and you begin to get the picture. We can dig deeper into the figures by considering a BAS estimate based on a regional conflict between India and Pakistan. In this situation, BAS has put the figure at 5 million tons, or 5 teragrams, of soot being lofted into the atmosphere. It's worth adding that this is based on each country launching 100 warheads with an average yield of 15 kilotons. In a full-blown nuclear conflict, we're looking at 2 million kilotons. If we extrapolate this to fit our scenario, the figures make grim reading. According to a report published in the magazine Nature, a nuclear war between the United States, its allies, and Russia could inject as much as 150 teragrams of soot high up into the stratosphere. As a comparison, the recent forest fires in Canada and Australia produced 0.3 teragrams and 1 teragram of smoke, respectively. But this isn't a full picture. Because these fires were primarily wood-fueled, the amount of soot produced is far less than the urban fires that would follow a nuclear conflict. But these fires did demonstrate that smoke and soot, when heated by sunlight, are lifted high into the stratosphere. At such high altitudes, between 33,000 to 66,000 feet, it prolongs the time it stays aloft. All this soot would also do serious damage to the ozone layer. A recent simulation has shown that a global nuclear war would cause a 75% global ozone loss. Combined with falling temperatures and diminished sunlight, this substantial degradation of the ozone layer would exacerbate environmental and health crises. Increased ultraviolet radiation reaching the Earth's surface can lead to higher incidences of skin cancers and cataracts in humans, as well as disrupt the growth patterns of phytoplankton, which are crucial to marine ecosystems and the wider food chain. Furthermore, the disruption in phytoplankton populations affects the carbon cycle and depletes the ocean's ability to absorb carbon dioxide, compounding the effects of global cooling induced by the nuclear winter. So when will it all end? There is no clear agreement about how long a nuclear winter would last, but most estimates count the figures in years, if not decades. The bottom line is that according to the BAS, within 2 years of Putin launching his nuclear arsenal, over 5 billion people will have died from famine. This, we must remember, is not a film script written by an over-imaginative Hollywood writer. Although it is a hypothetical scenario, the events and consequences are grounded in science and publicly available information. We can only hope that Putin, on his deathbed, retains some semblance of sense and prioritizes the legacy of peace over destruction. But the responsibility is not just his alone. As Robert Oppenheimer famously said, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." We can't simply pin the blame on an individual. Humanity has placed itself in a position where one man, with one action, can become a destroyer of worlds. Putin may or may not press the button, but even if he doesn't, the next Russian president might have learned their lessons from him. What are your thoughts on the possibility of Russia launching all its nukes? How do you think world leaders should address the situation? Can world leaders engage with Russia to mitigate the risk? Would Putin even be interested in dialogue? Share your thoughts and insights in the comments below, and thank you for watching this video. Now go and check out Russia's top nuke targets, or click this other video instead.